Does the Austrian approach have any unique quibbles with what Eric is trying to do?
At the very least, what Eric is doing is, I think, saying if we're going to use math and calculus, let's at least use the cutting edge calculus, that kind of stuff. But I think it's possibly deeper than that. And I imagine some Austrians are going to come with me on this journey. And other ones are going to say, we can't go with you, Bob. No, here we stop.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
I don't know if you noticed, but creator of the term intellectual dark web, Eric Weinstein, has been all over social media in the last couple of days, crowing, absolutely beaming with pride about getting to converse with the great Dr. Robert Murphy recently on an episode of a certain podcast. Did you see that?
I did see it. And yeah, we are folks here continuing the meta trend of analyzing our previous interviews of people. So that's what we're doing here.
I figure you were just jealous that we got to do it from one of my Haman Nature episodes first.
I was.
You just had to jump on.
Yes. But I'm the poor man's Haman that I only was interviewing one person. You were interviewing two people simultaneously back when the one we covered.
You have room to grow.
Yep. So yes, folks, I was recently over at the Infi podcast, which is my day job as chief economist for Infinio. I interviewed Eric Weinstein, and we were talking all about economics. And so we're going to get into that. We have some choice clips for you. But yeah, what was pleasantly surprising to me is Eric enjoyed the experience as well. And when it posted, a lot of times when you interview somebody who's big on social media, Eric has like 1 million followers on Twitter. The standard thing is and have your guest, give them some copy and then let them tweet out, to make it as easy as possible for them to leverage the interview for their audience as well. And we didn't have to do that. Like Eric just retweeted it and he's like, oh yes, my episode dropped and this was good, that finally an economist who actually wants to hear my ideas or something. Cause that's part of the, narrative here that he's telling is that he's been banging his head against the wall for 30 years and the economists don't want to listen. So I did. I'm not like the other economists.
I won't hurt you. Yeah, so we have some clips. Yay. Is there anything you want? Well, first, I guess I want to ask you just your general thoughts about the conversation and what it means, perhaps not only for the mainstream neoclassical economists, but for the Austrians as well. What was the overall thrust?
Sure. So what I wanted to achieve in the interview, I did achieve, right? That specifically I had people asking me over the years, hey, have you heard, you heard this Eric Weinstein guy? One of his things is he's talking about like the marginal revolution went down the wrong path or something. And he wants to do this new, what the heck is going on with that? Is it just a new measure of inflation or something? And so just being clear about what is it, Dr. Weinstein, that you're saying, you and Pia Milani are contributing here. Like, what are you proposing? What claims are you making on its behalf? Because it sounds like you think this is more than just a different way to calculate CPI, which, definitely is the case. So I think, we really nailed down in the clips here, folks. I'll give some more as we go through this as to, what exactly is Eric claiming and so on. And then the other big thing is, as I'm sure you may have seen, Adam, but just me doing the research on this to get ready for the interview, there are a lot of people that hate Eric Weinstein's guts and think that he's a fraud and that, he doesn't have any peer-reviewed thing. He just goes around. He's really good on podcasts. And, it's not hard to get Joe Rogan to think you're a genius when you use some big words and, you got a PhD in math from Harvard. But, notice he keeps going from field to field telling the people that he's a genius and they're idiots. And all the, but all the big guns in each respective field say this guy's a con man, get out of here. And so he just retreats to podcast, right? So I can say enough that Eric was not bluffing with me about mathematical economics, the stuff he was talking about here. It's not just he had a passing familiarity and was, some, intelligent outsider who perused some articles and then starts shooting from the hip. That the stuff he was saying was very plausible, or coherent, I should say, like internally, because he was speaking nonsense. And so, I can't right now evaluate, like if he misstated something in terms of his discussion of gauge theory, I wouldn't have caught that in the interview, right? But I'm saying everything he said vis-a-vis the economics checked out, and it doesn't mean at the end of the day I'm going to say, yes, everybody should follow his lead here, but what he's saying is not absurd the way, some of his harshest critics are alleging. So I will say that. Certainly, and we'll get more specific, folks, when we go through the clips, his critique of neoclassical, mathematical economics, I think is very strong. As far as should Austrians care? At the very least, it's interesting. It's sort of like Nassim Taleb. He and I had some correspondence over the years, and I think Taleb likes the Austrians for making fun of guys like Krugman or Paul Samuelson, but we're coming at it from different angles. That guys like Mandelbrot and Taleb aren't afraid to use math when it comes to modeling the financial sector, but their point is you got to use the right math. These Keynesian guys, they're not even, they're using kiddie math. What the heck is this? It's giving this veneer of rigor when no. So anyway, that's I think at the very least Austrians, and you could see it was a very friendly conversation that Eric and I had. So I think that's partly where, we all agree that the leading guns in terms of mathematical economics are bluffing the public, and that the rigor behind their field is not nearly what they purport it to be. The last thing I'll say before we get into the clips here, Adam, and obviously I want to hear your general reaction too before we do that, is I don't think this is merely a turf war between different mathematical economists, and he's just saying, oh, my math's better than yours, but if you're an Austrian, you're kind of above it all, and you guys are all kidding yourself. I understand the temptation to do that, and if some Austrians just want to say that, fair enough. I can't say you're wrong. But some of the stuff Eric was saying about how you would, he was saying, there's no such thing as the price level. That's like saying the average temperature, or he's just saying, what's the temperature of the U.S.? That's crazy. You wouldn't even talk like that. I think there are some implications there where Austrians might have just said, oh yeah, everything is subjective and ultimately it's the individual and you can't really do it. And I think he was given more practical procedures you could use to, at least in principle, think through what would it mean to talk about someone from 1960 who lives in Cleveland, and what's $100 to him there, and then how much money would he need to have 20 years later if he lived in Miami?
Yeah,
and,
I was very.
That's, I think Eric has really thought through what would that mean in practice to talk about to give him the quote the same income. Whereas I think a lot of Austrians just say, oh, yeah, well, things change, but what we could talk about is the evenly rotating economy. And it's like, well, what if it's not the evenly rotating economy? Are we just saying you can't do it? Or are you just saying, well, in principle, you would do it this way? So I think Eric has really thought through, and it's not just math. He really has thought through the economics of what would it mean to really answer that question.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by what I understood of what he was talking about. And then I was really overjoyed because he said the map is not the territory, and referring to these models and these, mathematical tools. And I thought, well, if a guy that's real smart is thinking along those lines, I definitely want to hear more.
Yes. Turn it over to you. Where do you think the best place to start is?
Well, given that we're doing this at a high level, the way I look at it is that this got framed radically incorrectly.
Okay.
And this came out in 1996. It had been brewing in the early 90s between P.M. Milani and myself. And it's not about index numbers. It's not about inflation. It's not about growth. It's about marginalism. And if you think about marginalism as the penetration of the differential calculus into economic theory, obviously you don't call something the marginal revolution if it's small potatoes. And any time changes in the differential calculus have penetrated economics and market thinking, you get nothing short of a revolution. So, for example, stochastic differential calculus in option pricing in Black-Scholes-Merton is a revolution. You could make a case for nonlinear programming. Various aspects of differential calculus thinking have completely upended how we think about economics. So the attempt here is to upgrade all of economics to the most modern form of the differential calculus. Now, if we call it gauge theory, it sounds sexy. It goes back to Hermann Weyl calling it gauge theory, I think 1917. But it's not anything more than a very simple idea about differential calculus. And the claim is that not only does economics need differential calculus, it already is a version of gauge theory. That is, economics as it is understood today, the very concepts that underlie the heart of, let's say, Marshallian demand or theory of the consumer, are gauge theoretic concepts, not recognized as such. And so, just as, Moliere's bourgeois gentleman does not know he's been speaking prose all of his life, I don't think economists understand that they've been doing gauge theory all their life, and that they need to recognize that because they're often using the inappropriate choice of a derivative in the calculus sense. And so, in essence, there are multiple concepts of a derivative where we tend to teach our calculus students that you take the derivative as if there's only one. And you have to choose the correct derivative because in all of calculus, we should agree that when something is derivative equals zero, there is some notion of constancy. And in economics, there are different notions of constancy, and they come from different choices of a derivative operator.
So I guess I have a few questions if you don't want to just dive right in.
I do want to answer your question. Let me just say something real quick before I lose sight of it. So it was interesting the way he's viewing it. Again, he certainly doesn't think this is just about calculating CPI. He also doesn't think it's about dynamic preferences, right? Because as we got in the discussion, the more I read his stuff and saw, he had sent me a bunch of material ahead of time, presentations that he and Pia Milani is now his wife, by the way. So, she got her PhD in Harvard in, I think, 96. And, I think they were dating at the time. Maybe they were engaged. I don't remember. And, he had his math PhD from Harvard. And so, he's talking to her about economics. And then he knows all about the use of game theory in physics. I think that was like what his dissertation had been on. And so then, realizing, what you economists aren't using this, this development in math over in your field. Well, geez, look at all the stuff you could do. And then realizing, wait a minute, this isn't just some parlor trick. Like this really has a lot of economic implications. So one thing, and I think we'll get into it in these clips, is he thinks this approach very easily and naturally handles the possibility of somebody's preferences changing over time, whereas he claims that's the Achilles heel right now of standard neoclassical economics. So one might have thought that was going to be how Eric described, but as you saw there, no, the way he pictures it and what it is they're doing and why, he has such grandiose claims on behalf of their insight is he's saying, economics back, the marginal revolution that gave us the dividing line between the classical school and now, quote, modern economics, that you guys really, like, the revolution was very timid because you only use this one, the most simple notion of a derivative, right? So that's how he's viewing it. So I just thought that was interesting. And as we get into this, we can talk more about the specifics. But okay, I'll stop there. What do you want to say?
Yeah, I just had a couple more basic questions. Do you agree with his assessment that the marginal revolution could be described as the penetration of differential calculus to economic theory? Do you think that's the right way to look at that?
Well, it's probably a true statement, but I don't think it. I don't agree with the spirit of what he said.
Right.
All right. So specifically, and I'm sure many of our listeners would already have jumped to this conclusion, the marginal revolution is associated with three people. That, Karl Menger of the Austrian school, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras. Incidentally, a lot of people say Walras. I'm pretty sure I've talked to a French guy in my program. I think it's Walras. All right. So anyway, and Menger obviously was not very mathematical at all. He certainly didn't use calculus when he was doing his verbal exposition of what we now call the marginal revolution, overturning the old classical cost or labor theory of value and replacing with subjective modern marginal utility theory. Whereas Jevons was somewhat mathematical, and Walras was very mathematical, okay, and kind of gave us what we now think of as general equilibrium theory. So having said all that, though, so where Eric is coming from certainly would be true if you were, today taught standard economics like in a top 10 program somewhere. It would be very mathematical. And yeah, you would think if, to the extent you even cared about the history of thought, you probably would think, oh yeah, and that's where we realize that talk about marginal utility. What's marginal utility? Oh, it's you take the derivative of your utility function with respect to, what happens if I get one more unit of apples, or, an infinitesimal more unit of apple, then what happens to my total utils, and right? So that would be a very plausible claim, except a lot of people say the marginal revolution actually is somewhat misnamed, that really it was a subjectivist revolution. Okay. And this, so clearly Austrians would talk like that, but I think even mainstream people, again, with a lot of these guys, they don't even read old, like they say, why the heck would I read something from the 1870s? What do I care? That's stupid. But to the extent that they cared about the history of their field at all, I think some of them would be receptive to the idea that really the revolution and going from the old cost and labor theory of value to the modern one was not valuing things on the margin. It was subjective valuation, from the demand side, as it were, as opposed to the reason a stagecoach trades for 6 chickens is because look at the labor you got to put into building a stagecoach versus raising 6 chickens, right? That's kind of like how the classical economists would explain long run market prices. Whereas what was brought in under the so-called marginal revolution was the other way around, that no, you start with consumer utility and preferences, and then you go the other way, right? So in order to do that correctly, you need to understand marginalism. But the point is, it was more than just looking at aggregates beforehand and, now we're just looking at marginal units. There was a much bigger shift than just that.
Very cool. That's what I thought. But taking it from Eric's perspective, do you think he's right or could be right that this gauge theory approach could be as big a revolution in the field of economics as he's saying?
Certainly for people who like mathematical models of the economy. So for a standard, what we call neoclassical economist, it's possible that, put it this way, if Eric can do with this approach what he's claiming he can do, then yes, this would be, this changes everything, as they would say. So that's where, the jury's still out in my mind, is I still don't know. At this point now, given the conversation I just had with him, and I listened to it myself again in preparation for my conversation with you, Adam, I have a much better handle now on what he's claiming they can do with this approach. So let me say, it's a kind of thing, there's this, if you ever encountered, Adam, C.S. Lewis popularized it, but I don't know if he invented it, but the idea that when it comes to Jesus, you can't just say, he was a wise man who gave it. The thing is, they say the 3 L's. He's either liar, lord, or lunatic. In other words, when you look at the stuff Jesus said, the claims he was making, you got to either say, yep, he's the Lord, or he's a liar, or he's just nuts. You can't just say he was a wise teacher, but I don't think he was God, right? And so likewise with Eric, it's the kind of thing where, there's no middle ground here. He really is this utter genius that has made, major contributions all over the place, and he's so far ahead of everyone that the big guns in each field don't like him because he's saying you guys are idiots and you've built it on quicksand, and that's why only fringe people in each of the fields think he's cool and want to give him a chance. Right? So that story is consistent with him being that guy, or it's also consistent with him being a con man. Right.
So are you saying you're Peter, or are you saying you're Paul? Guess it would be Peter, right?
I'm saying right now I'm more
Thomas,
the guy who's who the authorities have sent that the Pharisees sent out to hear him, and then come back and they say, well, what did he say? And I've said, I've never heard such words. No man has spoken like this before. And I still don't know, but I want to go follow him more. And and if he starts doing miracles, then I'm going to say, whoa.
All right. If you are done with that, let's dive into clip 2, which has something a lot to do with path dependence, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Economists hearing this are going to say, yeah, there's various indices to correct for changing prices over time. Like we're trying to say, hey, the purchasing power of money between the year 1950 and 1960, there's various ways, various types of indices. And yeah, the divisia is one of them that was, proposed in the 1925 or whatever you said, sure. But each of them have their pros and cons. And one of the problems with that one is it's path dependent, like just actually computed. So it takes more numbers in between. And that seems kind of counterintuitive. Like if I just want to know between 1950 and 60, can I just take a snapshot in various prices and quantities? And the divisia index takes it. And so one of the results in Dr. Mulaney's dissertation that I found very compelling was to say, if we do make the switch that you're saying in terms of like the differential operator, swapping out the one that economists conventionally use for this new one that she proposes, then all these various indices give the same answer.
That's right. But more importantly, what I would say is the big shift. So divisia found sort of an echo of gauge theory, and it had the mysterious property of being path dependent. And that was thought to be a negative. And that's bedeviled the field ever since. What gauge theory shows you is why it is path dependent, why that is a positive thing. It is something that you should not try to rid the world of. Effectively, what this is curvature. And curvature is what generates path dependence. And so what you're seeing when people try to say we don't want a path dependent measure is that they are effectively the flat earth society of economics. They're the flat market society. And so you're trying to have a conversation saying the economy is round with a bunch of people saying, no, it isn't, it's flat. We just can't get this thing to go away. Because if you take any mechanical index, that is anything that takes in, let's say, dual period prices and quantities, and you chain it, and you say, well, okay, originally I have a year between readings. Now I'm going to do it every half a year, then quarterly, then every month, and every week. So now I have 52 readings. As you increase that frequency, you approximate usually one index, the divisia. It doesn't matter whether you begin with a Fisher, a Tornquist, a Posh, a Laspers, they all become the divisia. And the reason for that has to do with the fact that it is the correct way of thinking. The path dependence is a feature. It's not a bug. You can't get rid of it. And if you don't have path dependence, it's a sign that you're not actually doing economics.
I used to date a girl in college named Divisia.
Continuously?
Very nice.
No,
it was off and on. So, again, I have basic
questions. You could have
questions.
said no, she was chunky.
Ooh. No, I can't make leaps like that. So could you explain to the layman what he's trying to say about path dependency and why it would be a problem rather than a feature?
Okay, yes. So this is really good stuff here for the trained economists out there in particular. Okay, so in general, path dependency means it's to understand a situation, it's not enough just to look at the current readings, in general, whatever the context is. Like, it's not just to get a snapshot right now that you need to know, well, what happened? How did we get here? Right. So that's where that, what that term means. So the current situation, to evaluate it, you need to know what was the path by which we got it. It's dependent on the path, hence the term.
And two snapshots just won't get you there. You actually need to.
Right. So let me contrast. So normally, like I had never even learned about the divisia index, or if I did, I forgot about it.
You didn't go to the same college I went to.
It's just funny because I'm thinking of inappropriate. Anyway,
index, yeah.
Like, what would that mean?
What would that mean?
So, anyway, normally you'd say, like what I was saying there. I forget what years I picked, but you could say something like, "Okay, we want to see the change in purchasing power." Or, like a thing like, oh, Ron Paul, since the Fed's been formed, the dollar's lost such as. Well, what do you mean by that, right? And so you could say, oh, well, what we mean is you want to take a basket of goods in 1913 and compare them to a basket of goods today, and then just see what the prices are, like, how much more expensive is it? And so right off the bat, there's the Posh and Laspers indices are our two leading contenders, and they work differently. I'm going to get it mixed up here or not remember which is which, but one of them says, okay, yeah, you take the basket of goods, back then, like what could $100 have bought you back in 1913? And then you say, okay, that basket now you jump ahead to whatever, 2025, and say, how much is that? And then that's the way you calculate what's the change in the purchasing power of money. The other one goes the other way around, and they say, what could $100 buy you in 2025? And then you go backwards and say that same basket. And they're similar, but actually the way you do it correctly, and it might have to do with like what the representative basket is too. Like, so, because the way I just said it right there, you might think, shouldn't that be the same number each way? But the composition of the baskets could be different, right? Like, in other words, what the representative basket was in 1913 is obviously not the representative basket in 2025. Okay, so there's that element where it's not the same basket, and so that's why the numbers could be different. They're not going to be radically different probably, but you can see how it's not going to literally give you the same answer, and so that's why. But that's not path dependent. All you need to do to use either of those popular indices to come up with your estimate of what's the change in the purchasing power of money since the Fed's been founded is all you need to know is what were the prices and possibly quantities of stuff in the first year and now the second year, and that's it. You just do some arithmetic. So that's path independent, those two approaches I just told you. And then the Divizia one, though, you can't even do it if you just have those numbers, because you need to theoretically, like optimally or ideally, it's defined continuously. So it's not just that you have discrete data points in time. It's like you kind of need to know what's the flow of the price and quantities, from time zero up to time, capital T, and then you got to like take the integral or something over that whole period, right? So you can approximate it and break it up into smaller chunks. So that's what he was getting at there, where he was saying with all these different indices, when you start chaining them, so if instead of like the thing I said, taking the bundle, like the representative consumer bundle in 1913, how much does it cost? Take that same bundle in 2025, how much does it cost? You say, well, that's a big leap. What if, because we know that the types of things consumers buy in 2025 is way different so how about we, every 5 years, pick a new representative bundle and then do that, method we said, just keep chaining it and doing it that way. Say, the drop in purchasing power from 1913 to 1918 was such and such. And then from 18 to 23, you get what I'm saying? And so his point was, as you increase the frequency of those, or shrink the duration of each of those discrete steps, it doesn't matter which method you use, they all start approaching the same amount. You get what I mean?
I do. Yeah.
And so then, and then in the limit, as the increment goes to zero, they all tend towards the Divizia index, defined, as a calculus integral. Okay. And so then they all would end up having path dependency in that sense. Okay. So normally the way economists talk about that, if you were listing the pros and the cons of the various indices, they would say, yeah, the Divizia has some interesting features, but the problem is it's path dependent, right? So normally economists think that that's a bug. And he's saying here, it's not, that we show in our framework that actually it makes sense once you think through the implications of it. Of course, the path you took to get here would matter and would be economically relevant. And once you see that, you realize, so his point was, there's a sense in which you might want to just say, yeah, Weinstein just saying the Divizia index is the one to use. We've known about that since 1925 or whatever. What the hell? And he's saying, no, we now have the economic intuition to understand why that's the best one. Whereas, Divizia himself didn't know that. And certainly economists who've been rejecting it all along didn't understand why, because these idiots think path dependency is a bug when no, it's a feature.
Yeah. What did you think when he made the provocative statement, if you don't have path dependence, you're not doing economics?
I'll try to keep this brief because I was playing around with this. And we're going to get to this a little bit when we do the Arrow's theorem clip. But there's a sense in which what they're trying to say is, again, you want to say something like, again, go back to what I said a minute ago. They're trying to break it out and not just look at aggregates. And so they want to say, like, even at an individual level, instead of talking about what's the purchasing power of money for Americans in 1913 compared to 2025, instead it's like, what's the purchasing, Jim right now, who's in the year 1960 is a 25-year-old living in Phoenix. And if he has $100 and he really likes to drink Coke and he's, dating a girl, whatever, what does he care about? What can he get for $100? And now let 20 years pass. And Jim has moved. Now he's 40, right? Did I say he was 20? Because now he's 40. And he's moved to wherever, Cincinnati. And he's married. And he has 2 kids. And he's trying to, be real healthy now. And so now how much money do I need to give him the same level of economic welfare as $100 would have given to his 20-year-old self, given all the different conditions he faced? He was a different person 20 years ago. So do you see how the way Eric is thinking about it, there's way more involved than just, oh, prices are higher. Like, holy, the people are different. Their tastes have changed. You know what I'm saying? And so he's saying, though, it's not impossible. Not just, I think this is what you were getting at earlier. I think Austrians would just say, well, yeah, I mean, things change and whatever, and you can talk about the evenly rotating economy, and those are thought experiments, but I mean, ultimately, entrepreneurship, baby, and you can't control things, and people are unpredictable, human action, right? But no, Eric is saying, no, how about we say more than that? Like, if you're really in principle, how would you do? And so he's saying, basically, moment to moment, the $100 that he has the guy, the 20-year-old, to say, I want you every moment to roll that basket of goods over that you could, like, what do you want to spend your $100 on? And he picks the thing that, maximizes his utility at that moment. And then just say check in with him every minute or something. And then say, right now, if you could exchange that old bundle for something that has the same market value, just a barter transaction where there's no arbitrage, what would you do? And then just have him keep doing that until he's 20 years later and he's moved. And so it's that chain all along the way that's connected it. So there's no way you could do that thought experiment and just say, no, jump ahead to be your 20 years from now and you've moved and you're a different guy. That would just be just as crazy as you saying, yeah, Adam, right now, imagine that you were Paul Krugman. How much money would he need to have as much happiness as you have with $100 right now? You'd say, I don't know, he's a different guy. And so likewise, if you just say right now, picture a guy 20 years from now who's moved and has kids, how much would you say, I don't know, that's a different guy, that's not me. But you can kind of imagine yourself, 2 minutes later. So that's what he's getting at. And why once you see that's what he's trying to do, and that's what to him it really would mean to say, let's keep, how much purchasing power, how much money income would you need to put you on the same footing down the road as you did earlier? I think, Eric is saying to even answer that question meaningfully, it would involve the kind of thing I just walked you through. So clearly path dependence matters there. How could it not? If you're not using path dependence, then you're not doing economics. That's what he's getting at.
Very cool.
By the way, I don't think I even understood that until I just said that to you.
You're welcome.
What would you say is the favorite part of of this interview?
You said Coke, which made me think of Dr. Pepper, which reminded me that your friend and mine, Scott Horton, has a brand new Dashboard Academy where he's putting all of his amazing...
I was wondering where the hell you were going with that. I was,
You know where I'm going, baby. So, yeah, he's got a brand new thing. Why don't you tell the good people about his thing?
Yes. Folks, our sponsor for this episode is Scott Horton's new academy. I'm sure you've heard about it. And it is wonderful. And it is the kind of thing... I'm going to go out on a limb here. I don't think I'm going to hurt Scott's feelings that I think a lot of people listen to Scott. They say, well, we love him. He goes too fast and he assumes everybody knows a bunch of stuff. And he's just making aside comments. And then there's this guy. And then there's, oh, wow, we did this. And then so-and-so. And of course, but this guy is a Pashtun. And he's like, well, Scott, what are you talking about? I don't even know where these countries are located. And so what's happened in the Scott Horton Academy is his lectures, slow down. We put a restraining jacket on him and he's speaking at a normal speed and you can follow him. You can stop it and rewind and whatever. But also he has all sorts of other people. If you're interested in the question of, Christian Zionism, for example, there is an exhaustive discussion of that, treatment of that. And so all of these things are available. Do you want to say anything else from your point of view? And then I'll give them the news they can use.
Even if it was only about adding enough structure to make his amazing tangential lines of discussion just minimized, not eliminated, but minimized. It would be well worth the effort. Yeah, and he's got great. He's got that Jim Bovard lecture series all about his history of reporting how horrible the government is, and he's adding new courses by the month, I think. Yeah, it's what I've sampled so far is very, very good. I can't wait to sample the rest, and you all should go out and do likewise.
So how would they do that? One might wonder.
One might wonder that.
Yeah. ScottHortonAcademy.com/crossover. And if you go ahead and use that link, it will entitle you to 10% off if you do the yearly subscription, or 20% off if you do the full bore lifetime subscription. So again, go to ScottHortonAcademy.com/crossover.
Yeah, you should definitely get the lifetime one. That's got to be the best bang for the buck. Scott's young and healthy. And since you're supposed to repeat these things over and over, go to ScottHortonAcademy.com/crossover. So moving away from foreign policy and Dr. Pepper, back to Eric Weinstein and economics. This next clip has something to do with price levels, and what the heck are they even?
The idea that there is a price level is the problem. If I say to you, what is the temperature in America right now, you will not understand what I'm saying.
All right.
Right. But if I say to you, what do you think CPI is going to be next month? You're dumb enough to say, oh, I think it's going to be, and then you give a number.
Can I stop you for 1 second, Eric? Just so you know, I'm giving you the Austrian libertarian types who are listening. When you were going on with the group stuff, they were like, what the heck is this? But now you just want them back because that's a standard Austrian point.
It's good. Make the man laugh.
I will say to you, Adam, that's when I broke the ice, and he and Eric and I became buds, right? Up till that point, we had some phone calls and whatever, and it was very cordial and everything. But I'm saying in the interview, I think we were both a little bit stiff in the beginning. We weren't sure how it was going to go. And then that thing right there, got him to laugh, and he relaxed. And then he, we don't have the clip here, but he went on to say, here's what I like about you Austrian libertarian types. And so...
Yeah, it was great to see that moment. We'll put a link in the show notes to the whole interview, but you could really see just how butthurt Eric is over being stiff-armed by the economics profession for all these years. And it was very nice to see you two connecting like that. He was just someone taking him seriously, and, and hey, as you said earlier, if you want to gain traction, talk to another fringe economist. You're right there for the...
I've been hurt too.
Yeah, that was great. Do you want to say anything more about what's missing, talking about the price level?
Yeah. So I think there, and you can see it was because he said things like that reassured me back, 5 minutes ago, Adam, when I just told you, here's my epiphany. This is what he's doing. Him saying stuff like that reassured me that, okay, I'm on the right track. So again, when people are asking, what is he just proposing some new way to calculate CPI, and what he's arguing that he and Mulaney would have come up with a higher estimate, and the Boskin Commission wanted a lower estimate, and so they're just quibbling over numbers. Who care? No, you can see that's not doing justice to what they're talking about. So they're saying that this is a very primitive, crude approach, and we can't believe, given how much data now we have, and all the computing power and whatnot, that we're still talking about, the BLS reported that in October CPI rose such and such, when they wouldn't say temperature rose such as. It's funny when he said that, though. In the climate change literature, they do talk like that, right? Like that, they do say stuff like, well, the UN came out, and if the governments around the world just tax us by this amount, then we will limit the rise in global temperatures to such and such. I mean, so...
And they wonder why we don't take them seriously.
Among all the problems with that, it's also like, what do you mean by the global temperature? What are you talking... So, again, they can define it just like, you can define what's the CPI, but the point is you're mashing together all kinds of stuff, and is that really a useful metric?
When you're a young planet, you stick the thermometer in the South Pole. And then as you become an adult planet, you can put it in the North Pole.
I don't want to hear what you and Divisio are up to. All right, just that's between you guys.
So many indices. So shall we go on to clip 4?
Yes, this one is.
Something about Darth Vader.
Yeah. So here he's going to get into a Star Wars analogy, and he's talking about what is the weak spot of neoclassical economics.
Let me say it right now, because as you're going through, I realize formally, we haven't officially said this during this discussion so far, Eric, that part of what you're doing and why I understood that all the scope and the audacity of what you're claiming that you're giving us here is that your approach or your framework can easily handle changing preferences over time. Whereas for standard theory, it's kind of like, just, well, yeah, that's why you can't do anything. Like from an Austrian point of view, just remain real agnostic and just say, yeah, that's why these mathematical economists are nuts, because preferences change. We all know that. And so look at their goofy models where they have to assume they stay static. Otherwise, they can't use calculus. And so you're trying to combine the best of both.
Yeah. But let me make an analogy. Economics, professional economics, particularly macroeconomics, is like a Death Star from Star Wars. And this thing pulls up, traditionally USAID and the CIA and the State Department dispatch a bunch of economists from Harvard or Stanford or Chicago. Could be the Chicago boys to Latin America. Could be Andre Schleifer and Jeff Sachs from Harvard. Could be anyone. And we tell some country what they need to do. And sometimes we do things through the IMF or the World Bank, and join or die. And that's how we roll. And my claim is your Death Star has an exhaust vent. And if you don't play nice, and if you continue to pretend that you have a subject that's figured it all out and that you guys have ascended to some mountain, I can show you that your entire Death Star can be killed off by changing preferences. It's very clear in the literature. I think I sent you a great deal of excerpts and quotes that point out that what's happened is that more or less Gary Becker taped over the exhaust vent vulnerability with like no exhaust vent here written in red crayon, and said preferences are perfectly stable. They don't differ between people, and they don't differ over time. And he got Stigler to go along with that one. And that is why, in part, we rely on the Chicago school to tell the ultimate lie that no one believes so that the field doesn't collapse. Because once you understand that changing preferences are the Achilles heel of all neoclassical economics, the field does not exist in its presence. And that is why, from the time of about Alfred Marshall, people have increasingly become fanatical about asserting that somehow preferences are fixed and stable, when it is abundantly clear that there is no backing for this. This is a cult-like belief in an assertion about human beings that is invalidated by everything we know about advertising, addiction. You have these crazy articles like Rational Addiction, where people are being completely reasonable in their heroin habits, and they're not affected by advertising, or they have tastes that are stable in a meta sense. It's such nonsense. You have to recognize that we can fix the vulnerability of the Death Star, but you're going to have to play nice, because I don't want you guys rolling up and destroying the world the way you have been. Or you can feel free to take a swipe and claim that you don't have this vulnerability, and we'll just send a couple of torpedoes right down the exhaust vent and watch the entire neoclassical edifice disappear.
Let me, Eric, and presumably I'm going to speak on behalf of the mathematical economists. They're going to respond the same way in Star Wars when the one lower guy goes up to the admiral or something and says, "Sir, we've analyzed their attack pattern and there is a danger." And he's like, "What? At our time of victory, we won't evacuate."
Once again, you got the man to laugh, which is great. And finally, in that analogy, I finally understood what he's talking about, which is that using gauge theory, you could easily take out a couple of womp rats at 100 meters.
Yeah. Well, I think more specifically, he's saying don't use your guidance computer.
That's right. Yeah. Use the gauge.
Yeah. Okay. So Yeah, I like that too. Apparently, I included that clip because it was a fun thing where just like when he's talking to Rogan and they start talking about the Beatles or something, and he makes cultural allusion. Like I was keeping up with them, right? I'm cool. So yeah, what he's getting at there. Here, let me just spend a minute to try to explain to people the evolution. So again, the marginal revolution, that they're overturning the old approach to say like, why is it that there's certain patterns in market data? Why is it that it seems like some things have higher prices than others? And again, the old classical approach had to do with what the cost of production, and it kind of made sense, right? And there was, you could give a theoretical reason for that. Like no business is going to continue to make and sell a product at a lower price than it costs to build it, right? So that kind of shows why the prices in the long run have to at least cover the costs. And on the other hand, in the long run, a business isn't going to be able to make a product and sell it for above the cost if one of the costs is the interest on the, or they would call it profit on the capital, right? So they said, the wages for the labor, the rents to the landowners, and the profit to the capitalists, right? And so it can't be in the long run that the price is above those costs, because then just more people would flow into that sector. Get the idea, until the same rate of return prevails and blah, blah, blah. So that's what I said. But again, as you can see, like there's problems with that. And so that's why it was a revolution in the 1870s when they flipped it and said, no, the starting point is just, why does someone pay more for a steak than a hot dog? Because you get more enjoyment from the steak. Like that's the, the primitive basic starting point, and then you build up things from there. Okay. But to make sense of that and to operationalize it, they realized, okay, so ultimately you're talking about people's preferences, or they could have used utils or whatever, however you want to classify it, what language you want to use. But clearly, if you're just trying to come up with a story about market behavior, and then also just do things like, well, how come when the store has a sale, people buy more, right? And you start, getting more specific and whatever, and you have little models. Clearly, you got to have people have preferences for things. And to say that, oh yeah, normally you sell this much, but then when the store has a buy one, get one, people buy more of that. If you think about it, you kind of have to assume their preferences are the same yesterday and today and tomorrow in order to make sense of why the changing price affects the quantity sold, right? Because if your preferences were moving all over the place, then you wouldn't, have a stable target. Okay, so you can see where this is going. But even there, the standard approach would be people can have different preferences, right? Like you're trying to explain why when there's a sale on cigarettes, price, quantity goes up. But how come some people just, no matter what the price is, don't buy cigarettes? And it was, well, because some people aren't smokers. Okay. You see, but there was this famous paper that Gary Becker and George Stigler put out, the title of which was De Gustibus Non Est Disputandum. I'm butchering, that's the Latin phrase. There's no accounting for taste, or when it comes to taste, there's no dispute, or something like that is like the literal translation. And so what they did in this paper, it was a famous paper like in the 70s, I think. And I mean, this was a big deal. Like everybody reads this paper. I read it at some point going through grad school, either because of my Austrian background or because of my mainstream. I don't remember which, but I had read this paper before Eric gave me homework, basically. And in this paper, they push and say, it's not just that we're going to assume for a given person that your preferences are stable over time, which is kind of like what the default is. People think, oh yeah, people have different preferences. Like, in other words, that's partly how you, out of the gate, explain why is it that when people go to the grocery store and they all come out with different carts, you know what I mean? And how do you explain it? Well, because people's preferences are different. Now, each person's has to be stable. Otherwise, you can't make sense of why do sales do what they do. You get what I'm saying? But, okay. But Becker and Stigler push it further in that paper, and they say, no, we want to come up with a framework by which, even though your own preferences might change over time in like a predictable manner, in the sense that, you could build up an affinity, like when you're young, you don't like alcohol when you're 10, and then by the time you're 40, you might be, drinking Jack Daniels or something. You got to kind of build that up over time. Maybe you like classical music, maybe whatever, and they don't want that. They don't want to make it that your utility function changes over time. They want to just say, no, from birth, you had the utility function you're going to have, and it's just your experiences along the way and blah, blah, blah affected, the manifestation of how you act on that. But you ultimately, and then they want to even say, and it's the same for everybody. So really, when you want to understand why is it that, the single mom in Chicago buys certain things when she goes to the grocery store, but you buy different things as a, married man living in Florida, it's not because your preferences are different from hers. You guys all have the same utility function. It's just the arguments you're feeding into it are vastly different. Okay, so that's the long-winded context of what Eric is getting at here, where he's saying what economists originally posited different preferences to kind of explain consumer behavior, because obviously people do different things, but then you did kind of have to do the sorts of stuff we want to do in standard price theory. You had to assume people's preferences were stable, at least for a little bit, and then they just ran with it. And Eric is saying this whole edifice has been built up, and you see how he works in, the IMF and all this, and that's all true. Like there's when various third world countries get in trouble and they have a debt problem, the IMF will come in and say, "Yep, we'll give you a bailout package, but you got to do what our economists tell you. You got to liberalize trade, you got to remove capital controls, you got to cut your spending, you got to get these people off the dole." And they do a lot of quote neoliberal reforms, and that's packaged under the guise of this is rigorous Western capitalism basics for you, and that's partly why leftists hate what they call neoliberalism. And we can quibble with the term and say, oh, that's not real laissez-faire, and that's true, but you get why these people don't like that. Like they view the West's economists who like free markets ramming that down their throat. And gee, all these international companies come in and strip mine our resources, and our people, get their money cut off. And what the heck is this? So anyway, and that's why we vote for Marxists next election.
Apparently, in New York. So I asked 2 questions early on, and I'm going to ask.
And I answered 0 of them probably. Sorry.
I'm going to ask him
I'll
again.
stop talking and just get me back on track. I know I was going off on a tangent there.
No, it's not that you didn't answer them. But Eric once again made a real powerful claim, so I want to re-ask those questions in slightly a different way. How close do you think Eric's approach gets us to actually solving the problem of changing preferences over time? And then to his claim, is it really true that without this fix, all neoclassical economics is non-existent?
Okay. I can do the second one. Let's do the second one first.
That's allowed.
So what he means...
It's not path dependent.
Yeah. What he means... He obviously doesn't mean that they're going to stop teaching this stuff next year. Right? They're all going to just say, you got us, Eric. Damn you.
Well, the torpedoes haven't hit the exhaust portal.
Right. But what he means is, in order for the theories to have any relevance, they're inapplicable right now. That they've built this whole edifice that relies on some pretty strong assumptions that are clearly false. And so, and this is famous too. He probably doesn't like Milton Friedman, and his, Friedman has a famous essay where he says it's fine to make false assumptions so long as, the world behaves as if they were true. So the point is just as long as the predictions of your model are close enough, or at least qualitatively in the right direction, given the kind of problem you're trying to study with the model, then that's fine. And some people even take it so far and say simplifying false assumptions are a virtue because they help isolate, the thing we're trying to study. Okay. So I think Eric would say something like, given that you see that all over the place and this isn't just like, we had to dumb it down to teach it to the freshmen in college. No, this is like cutting edge stuff that they're saying it has really significant false assumptions built in at step one. That what relevance is this? That and those assumptions are affecting the answers, right? So I think that's what he's claiming, and that's what he's saying, that yes, the way economics right now, and you could see the big guns, like they're pushing the stable preferences. That's not just some relic from that was before we got good at math and now we're doing, like he's saying, no, the way they've gone, they have just solidified that, and they've doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on stable preferences. And by the way, partly in preparation for this discussion, Adam, I just tweeted out like 4 hours ago a quote from Gary Becker, not from this paper, it was elsewhere. And he said something like, I'm not going to get the exact wording right, but it might have even been his Nobel acceptance speech. I'm not sure about that, but he said something like the three-pronged approach of maximizing behavior, market equilibrium, and stable preferences used unflinchingly, and I forget, and he used some other adverb, is what to me constitutes the economic approach, something like that. So he didn't just say, oh, for convenience, we assume stable preferences. He built that into, you're not doing economics if you're not assuming stable preferences. Like that's what the economic approach entails. And also he threw in that, the unflinchingly.
Got to be brave.
And I said that with Eric that, that you heard, Adam, we don't have in the clips, folks, but I said, that's a weird thing to say. You know what I mean? Like it's almost like you're admitting, now I know there's going to be pushback because this is false, but still, we're going to just assume it's true and just ram it down your throat because we're economists.
It looks like the boat's on fire, but if we just keep sailing, it's going to be fine.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my answer to your number two. Then your number one is, does Eric have the solution? Like, can he say, it's
or is it plausible to think that this approach will get there?
I don't know the math well enough to say whether it does what Eric claims, but yes, if it does do what Eric says it can do, yes, it solves the problem if you want to solve it the mathematical way. In other words, maybe an analogy would be with game theory, that if you saw John von Neumann and Morgenstern and how they did it, and oh yeah, you come up with some clever results if you want to mathematically model strategic interactions, but really their framework only applies to two-person zero-sum games, and that's kind of limited. And so one reaction would just be to say, well, you can't model people with math equations, that's stupid. And you just be like, an open-ended Austrian. Or you could be John Nash and say, well, let me give you a different equilibrium construct and a much, richer strategy space that can handle, any kind of competitive game. And here's a way of approaching it. If we make some simple assumptions, I can guarantee there exists an equilibrium in this broader sense for any kind of game, right? So that's what Eric is doing, that second approach. He's saying the way you guys are trying to do this, your tools are way too limited. Let me give you this much richer mathematical framework, among other things, where the differential operator is much more open-ended and can be calibrated to the specific situation. And in that richer framework, you can easily handle stuff like, you can mathematically model preferences over time, and if they evolve, that's totally fine. You can handle that, whereas in standard models, you can't. Let me just say one last thing. Sorry, Adam, because I was thinking this through earlier today. I think a lot of people who have been trained in rigorous mathematical economics are going to be puzzled, and they say, what? We can handle... there's this thing called the Arrow-Debreu general equilibrium framework of markets, and it's the kind of thing where, at time zero, you can just look ahead and you can buy, they assume that there's contracts available for the delivery of any type of good or service conceivable, not only at every future point, but even under every possible state of the world. If there's random shocks that just occur over time, and just so long at T0, we can just look ahead at all possible future instance in the entire vector of possible goods and services I might want. And right now we can just buy contracts that spell all that out. I can, know what my, work is going to be over time and how much income I'll earn at those things. And I can just spend it all right now and do my plan. Boom. And that can all be maximizing my utility as of right now, taking into account that when I'm 80 years old, I'm going to need a retirement home possibly. And so I'll make sure I get an annuity that will pay off enough, blah, 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 or I get long-term care insurance, right? You can do all that, but I realize that's not solving the problem. Because even though there you might be saying your preferences change by you right now looking ahead to when you're going to be in the retirement home or whatever, that's not changing. That still can't handle, okay, but what if 10 years from now you change your mind?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or you realize, oh, I don't like retirement homes, that those places, you go nuts there. I don't want to do that.
Strictly speaking, even projecting into the future what you think. It's still your present preferences.
Right.
Because time has not occurred,
Right. So that's, anyway, I'm just saying that someone might have thought like, oh, we can handle that. And it's just, that's so open-ended. You can kind of do anything in models like that, or you can make real simplifying assumptions. Like, let's just say your current preferences just repeat over time and you just have a discount rate or so. But my point is that, even if with the full-blown, everything in the kitchen sink is thrown into the model, open-ended, infinite number of markets and goods and whatever, that, again, I'm just repeating myself, that's not what Eric is trying to account for. He's trying to say, no, I want it to be that even your ordinal preference relations can change over time and we can handle that. Whereas other things, it's like, no, I mean, you're just kind of a different person.
I'm glad you brought up game theory. We just did a great episode on it, I think. And we were, picking apart some of the flaws, where it leads to just goofiness, which makes me want to ask the following question. Does the Austrian approach have any unique quibbles with what Eric is trying to do? Like, do we buy indifference curves, or aggregating preferences and comparing them and all that, or are we just putting those objections to the side for the moment and seeing how the neoclassical approach can be improved? Or do we have anything to say about that?
Okay, so at the very least, I would say Austrian should be interested in from the last point you just made there, to say, kind of like I told you, like, why did I go into game theory when I was at NYU? And I was like, well, if I'm going to use math models and stuff, let's at least just go all the way, right? Instead of this crazy let's assume there's one household that lives forever. Like, that's stupid. Right. So there's that element that at the very least, what Eric is doing is, I think, saying if we're going to use math and calculus, let's at least use the cutting edge calculus, that kind of stuff. But I think it's possibly deeper than that. And I imagine some Austrians are going to come with me on this journey. And other ones are going to say, we can't go with you, Bob. No, here we stop. Is that, and this came out a few times in the interview. I don't know if it jumped out at you, Adam, but Eric was saying, like, I don't believe in cardinal utility. I understand the dangers of going down there. I like you guys and your focus on the individual. And this is consistent with his stuff about there is no price level. It's like, maps of things in the individual. And so I think what he's showing is, like, he's not aggregating. And I'll save this discussion when we talk about Arrow's theorem in a minute. I think that's the last clip. But that Eric is not saying, oh, this is the way to come up with the price level. He's saying, no, you disaggregate, and we're giving you the mathematical framework to handle that coherently. And he's not doing cardinal utility. He is not aggregating, to come up with social preferences and things like that. So I guess I will say some of what he was doing, like, I'm reading into it, but I think it's possible that he's brushing up against some of the problems I was having in grad school when I was critiquing the Austrian pure time preference theory of interest. And I was saying the way this is conventionally described in the canonical works, from like Mises and Rothbard and Kerzner, for example, to me, it implied cardinal utility, in a way that the Austrians typically don't like. And I was saying, like, for example, just give you one quick example. They'll say, oh, what if a guy in December is offered the choice between present ice or ice to be delivered in July? And you can imagine the guy saying, I don't need ice right now. I'll take a ticket that entitles me to ice to be delivered in July. And so you say, oh, isn't that a future good being preferred to a present good? And the standard Austrian response say, no, they're different goods. Ice to a guy in December is different from ice to a guy in July. And so then I was really getting philosophical and getting there and said, well, what do you mean? That you're kind of comparing, the instantaneous satisfaction to him in December compared to he's looking ahead to saying, what will this feel like when I consume it in July? And then you're trying to compare those things across time. You get what I'm saying? And so, it's not merely saying, like, oh, do you want a hamburger now or a steak now? And you can say, well, those are different goods. Or do you want a hamburger now or a steak in July? And you can see how you say those are different goods. But when you're saying the ice and they're different for, you're like getting in the guy's mind or something. So anyway,
You're not time traveling. You're
yeah.
getting in his mind,
And
his understanding of his preferences and
So
July.
anyway,
Yeah.
I was just, we don't, whether people agree with me or not here, my point is just, I'm trying to answer your question that to me, I did see some connection with that. And so I was wondering, oh, if we just, hang out in this space for a little while and I work through this stuff and maybe, correspond with Eric a bit. Say, are you saying this? Or you do that? Yeah, I don't think at the end of the day at Mises University, we're going to spend the first 2 days, teaching fiber bundles. That's never going to happen. But I do think, like, just the way I walked you through the intuition earlier, when I said I had my eureka moments, I've never realized that until you just forced me to say it. Like there, I wasn't using calculus. I was just going through stuff. And I'm saying I never would have walked through that had I not been reading up on what Eric's doing with this stuff. So.
Well, it wouldn't be a podcast worth watching or listening to if we didn't talk about Kenneth Arrow. So shall we?
Let's do it.
Economists used to be much smarter.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk about Ken Arrow and Paul Samuelson because I had the good fortune to be able to talk to both of them. In the case of Arrow, face to face, in the case of Samuelson over the phone about this. And what they had to say was like legitimately fascinating. So Arrow, when he heard about this result, had me initially to breakfast and then out to Stanford. And at breakfast, he says, I have to tell you, your result can't actually be right. And I said, okay, can you explain why? And he said, well, I have this thing called the impossibility theorem. And I chuckled because, of course, I knew about it. He said, what it says is that you cannot aggregate preferences in a coherent fashion between many individuals at a single instant in time. Can't be done. It's impossible. And what you're doing is you're fighting a duality. And in that duality, a single individual over many instants of time is directly equivalent to many individuals at a single instant in time. And what you're talking about would be a solution to the impossibility theorem. And I'm positive that the proof holds. And, at first I didn't even really grasp what he was saying because I didn't see it in the same way at all.
Yeah. Can I stop you? I don't want to say it, but let me just make sure the listener, because I love this story, but I want to make sure the listener gets it. So folks, Arrow's theorem has some postulates, like in social choice theory, it's a landmark result. Say you got a bunch of different people, they have different ordinal rankings of various states of the world or outcomes, and with some basic postulates about like there shouldn't be a dictator. If everybody prefers A to B, then the social welfare ordering should prefer A to B, stuff like that. And he showed there's no way of aggregating all these disparate subjective individual ordinal rankings into one social ordinal ranking that satisfies all these very reasonable criteria. And so what Arrow is saying is this guy, Eric Weinstein, is coming along saying, I figured out a way to solve the problem of different ordinal rankings by an individual over time. And then Arrow's saying, well, no, I mean, mathematically, that's equivalent to just treat, myself at T and T plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 is Jim, Bob, and Sally at the same time. And my theorem showed that's impossible. So you must be wrong. Okay, so go ahead.
So what I didn't understand is that he saw that as equivalent. And I said, no. I hadn't understood that this is how you were seeing it. There are two pivotal differences between the two situations. This is a false duality. He said, what do you mean? I said, the first thing is your result is a result in social choice theory. There is no market. You're voting on, let's say, 3 different candidates, or as you say, 3 different outcomes of the world. And what you're saying is that you cannot aggregate a heterogeneous group as if it was a single consistent super individual. So that if everybody agrees on a choice, that choice has to hold. There isn't one person who has dictatorial rights and small changes don't result in violent changes, whatever this list of axioms is. And he said, and the second? And I said, well, the second is that there is no morphing of Bob into Sally, into Arjun, into Letitia. That just doesn't exist. And you do morph into your future selves over time. So you're also not in possession of a path which connects all of the individuals who are being aggregated. And those two things break the apparent duality that you're appealing to. And I'm not going to disagree with you that in their absence, you'd be right. You'd be correct. But that's why the intertemporal market situation and the intra-agent social choice situation are not in duality. There was like a long silence. And he said, oh.
So, yeah, what do you think? Is Eric right? Are those things so disparate that the theorem doesn't apply?
I think so. And by the way, that was what, when I originally had a phone call with him more than a year ago, when he told that a shortened version of that story, that's when I really said, okay, I don't think this guy's bluffing, because the story was plausible. In other words, right, that he's sitting here telling me, oh yeah, I had lunch with this Nobel Prize winner and da-da-da. And what he had Arrow saying was totally plausible to me. As you saw, that's why I stopped him and paraphrased, even though the way Eric tells the story, at first he didn't understand even what Arrow's deal was. Whereas to me, I was like, oh, I know exactly why Arrow thinks something doesn't add up here. And then Eric's response also to me, I was like, oh yeah, I see what he's saying. And so that's when I said, okay, I don't think this guy is a charlatan the way his critics are alleging. And this is also, by the way, more recently why I got Eric on the podcast, right? Because he had kind of given me a bunch of homework, and then I got bogged down with stuff because I really wanted to do a bunch of research before having him on so I could be a good interviewer. And then he had a conversation with Grok about this stuff, and his fans were like, oh, this is great, Eric, Grok really gets it. And then of course the critics were, yeah, Grok always agrees everyone's a genius, this is stupid, and there's Arrow's theorem, right? And some guy who's a trained economist, right, in other words, you have to know enough to know what Arrow's theorem is, and he was saying like, no, Arrow's theorem is very open-ended. It wasn't just about voting for candidates. You could build in, like, the fact that there could be market prices, that could be in there, and that's all possible. No, Arrow proved in general there is no mechanism by which you can map from blah blah blah. So anyway, that's when I saw that going on. That's when I texted Eric and I said, hey, we got to just have this conversation because this is this can't wait. So anyway, yeah, I love that discussion. And yes, Adam, I think his response works. And I also think, going back to your earlier stuff about should Austrians even care, I think that's really interesting that the way he's trying to solve this problem is, again, going back to what I was saying with the individual and how do you, in principle, how could you do it and say, well, the 20-year-old, what would you spend the $100 on? And you look at that, and now just every moment in time, just say, okay, now that you're a little bit older, what would you exchange? I'd probably say, oh, if I had my druthers now, I would take that old bundle and I would exchange it for a new bundle, right? And you're not allowed to kick in more money or to make you can't sell it and keep some of the money to go, do something else with, right? You got to just keep rolling it over into a bundle that at those current market prices has the same, value, and you just keep rolling it over that way. And so there, I really do think he's getting on something deep there, that you need market prices to help you understand, what it is. So in other words, it wouldn't be enough just to say the individual over time, how do your tastes change? And, oh yeah, when I was 20, I would have wanted, a 40 of this malt liquor and blah, 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 and whatever. And I used to listen to rap back then. Oh my God. And da-da-da. And now when I'm older, I'd rather, but to know what's the comparable bundle, you need to have prices. You get what I'm saying? Like, it's not enough just to know how to have your taste change. In order to answer the question, you need to know what existing market prices are. And so that's not something that's only due to, competitive market process, right? So anyway, there's a lot there about, like, it seems like it intersects with a lot of Austrian stuff.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Is there anything more you wanted to say? The only thing I have left is, as I was going through the interview, there were terms thrown out that I didn't really understand what they meant. I was going to run them by you. Mm-hmm. But given where we're at in the time, if you have anything more important in closing, then maybe you should just do that.
Well, I will say, if people found those clips intriguing, by all means, go to the show notes page and check it out. The full interview. It's like about 2 hours, I think, is what it went. Yeah. Because there's more where that came from.
That's for sure.
And I guess I'm going to think more about this stuff and digest it, and maybe do some of the Human Action podcast, or maybe a solo one here, going through it, and I am going to be in touch with Eric about as we get some more feedback from people and whatnot to try to take this further, because I do think part of what's happening here is people just don't get what he's saying, and then because he comes off
I get it
hard, and so I can see why. Instead of them saying, well, let's give this guy a little bit more chance to explain himself, and he is saying we're completely full of it, maybe he's right. No, they're just going to say, get out of here. What the hell are you? So I get that reaction, but I think there's enough there that it's definitely worth at least me pursuing this just to see, if there's even a small chance that this guy can do what he's saying, then I think it's worth pursuing. So I am going to do that.
Oh, that's fascinating. I hope fruit is born from those efforts. Forget my questions about terminology. Look these things up, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great conversation. I was fascinated by it the first time through, and then going back again and cutting out these clips. Eric's a real smart guy, and he's got the kind of wisdom that comes from being smart about a lot of different fields, which means your intuitions can be supercharged. You'll see something in some other area that may be applicable in another one, and you wouldn't see it if you're just head first down the trough into this one thing. I remember being impressed by Terence Tao, the mathematician, because he was similarly brilliant in many different aspects of math. I assume. I didn't understand a word the guy said, but it's what seemed to be going on. And yeah, I do think that's a superpower, to be able to go deep enough to be relevant, but also be able to do that in a bunch of different interesting fields. I think that's what turns you into a guy who really pushes the needle forward, makes humanity wiser, richer. So yeah, check that out. Go to bobmurphyshow.com. Go to Haman Nature, Haman. Please check out our sites and go to our various YouTube pages and like them and subscribe to them. You got any parting words of wisdom for the good folks, Bob?
Just go check out the full interview and go to ScottHortonAcademy.com/crossover.
ScottHortonAcademy.com/crossover so that we can wet our beak. I don't know what accent that was. Thanks, Bob. This was awesome. I was thrilled to see you get this interview, and I think you handled it very, very well. I hope something amazing comes from it. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll catch you next time.
So long.